Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler with your video lesson of the day. And today's warm-up was, what is the Missouri Compromise and what is its historical significance? Well, the Missouri Compromise, as you know, because this is review, was three things. First, Missouri came into the Union as a slave state. Second, Maine came into the Union as a free state. And anything above the 3630 line in the future, any states that were added above the 3630 line in the future would be free. Now, the historical significance of the Missouri Compromise is it preserved the voting balance in the Senate between representatives from the free states and representatives from the slave states. Now, I want to add one more thing to this. John Quincy Adams was there when they passed the Missouri Compromise. And he went home that evening and he wrote his thoughts down in his journal. And he wrote this: I have favored this Missouri Compromise, believing it to be all that could be effected under the present Constitution, and from extreme unwillingness to put the Union at hazard. But perhaps it would have been a wiser as well as a bolder course to have persisted in the restriction upon Missouri till it should have terminated in a convention of the states to revise and amend the Constitution. This would have produced a new union of 13 or 14 states, unpolluted with slavery. If the union must be dissolved, slavery is precisely the question on which it ought to break. Well, in his diary entry, John Quincy Adams describes which alternate solution to the issues that dealt with the Missouri Compromise. Well, let's take this one piece at a time. My first question is, does John Quincy Adams like the Missouri Compromise? And according to his quote, he does. I have favored this Missouri Compromise, so he likes it. Now, why does he like it? I have favored this Missouri Compromise, believing it to be all that could be effected under the present Constitution, and from extreme unwillingness to put the Union at hazard. He likes the Missouri Compromise because it saves the Union. Remember, what would have happened if they would not have passed the Missouri Compromise? It sounded like there was going to be war between the North and the South. Sounded like the southern states might secede. So he liked it because it saved the Union, it kept the Union together. Now, then he had another thought, and this is what he wrote down. But perhaps it would have been a wiser as well as a bolder course to have persisted in the restriction upon Missouri. Now, a lot of the people that lived in Missouri at the time had slaves. So if they were going to restrict Missouri, they were not going to let them have slaves. Now, if that would have happened, they probably would have had to change the Constitution, amend it so that slavery was illegal. And we know that that's what they would amend it to, because in the last part it says this would have produced a new union of 13 or 14 states unpolluted with slavery. So let's read this last part again. Let's read the whole thing again. I have favored this Missouri Compromise, I like it, because believing it to be all that could be effected under the present Constitution, and from extreme unwillingness to put the Union at hazard. I like it because it saves the country. But perhaps it would have been a wiser as well as a bolder course to have persisted in the restriction upon Missouri, not let them have slaves, until it should have terminated in a convention of the states, a meeting of the states, to revise and amend the Constitution. Well, how would they amend the Constitution? Well, if when they amended it, it would have produced a new union of 13 or 14 states unpolluted with slavery. So obviously, the amendment to the Constitution that he was referring to would have been to make slavery illegal. So, in his diary entry, John Quincy Adams describes which alternate solution to the issues that dealt with the Missouri Compromise: a constitutional amendment stopping or prohibiting slavery. All right, today's lesson is on During the antebellum time period, or the time period before the Civil War, northern and southern culture, people, economy, and transportation. All right, the North's economy. The Industrial Revolution changed the economy in the North from a farming to manufacturing. This is review. Machines allowed for mass production, and many people worked in factories. Now, these factories that people worked in were very dangerous. They were noisy, they were hot, the working conditions were bad. If you notice, these machines have all these belts and there's no guards over the gears. And look, they had children working in here. They didn't have child labor laws at the time. Women worked in here with dresses, and sometimes their clothes would get caught in these gears and they would lose arms or sometimes even their life. So factories weren't a very pleasant place to work. So to be able to work in these factories, people needed to live close, so cities began to grow. And after a while, cities became crowded, and many people had to live in very unhealthy, unsafe conditions. So big cities in the Industrial Revolution times were not a very pleasant place to live. Now, the southern economy was based on agriculture, and the South was divided up really into three parts, the upper, the middle, and the lower South. But when we talk about it, we talk about the upper South and the deep South. Now, in the upper South, they grew tobacco, wheat, and other vegetables. And in the lower or deep South, they grew cotton. Now, cotton was king. Cotton was where they made a lot of money. And cotton was what they needed slaves for. After the invention of the cotton gin, this led southern plantation owners to grow more cotton. And remember, the cotton gin, one person could clean 1 pound of cotton a day before the cotton gin, and one person could clean 50 pounds of cotton a day after the cotton gin, just this little handheld one. And they could do more if they made big ones, which they did. So because they wanted to grow more cotton, they were going to need more slaves. So the cotton gin to help increase slavery and kind of rejuvenate the slave situation. All right, so in your foldable, I want you to write these 5 bullets down, these 4 bullets down. Growth of industrialization on the north side, and specialization and machinery allow for mass production. And then on the southern side, cotton is the leading cash crop, and industry is limited in the South due to lack of capital or money and market demand. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, northern agriculture. Northern railroads gave farmers access to new markets. Technology like steel plow and reapers changed farming and made it so farmers could plant more crops. Mostly this happened in the West. But farmers were worried about moving over to the Great Plains, and they had wooden-headed plows before, and they didn't think their plows could plow that really thick grass that grows out there. But when they developed these metal plows, no problem. It cut right through it. Well, despite the improvements in agriculture, the North turned away from farming and continued to develop industry. And the reason was it was hard to make a living farming the thin, rocky soil of the North. So industry continued to grow. These farmers, and especially in New England, they'd come out in the spring, they'd put their plow in the ground, and they'd go about 5 feet and they'd hit a rock. So they'd have to stop, and then they would go dig the rock out, throw it off to the side, get back behind their plow, and go about 5 more feet and hit another rock. Well, plowing the field up in the Northeast was like that because that's how the ground was. And it took them a longer time to get the fields plowed, but they eventually did it, and they grew their crops, and then winter hit, and then the next spring they'd go out there again thinking, wow, I already got the rocks out last year, but they'd go 5 feet, and they'd hit another rock. They'd go 5 feet and hit another rock. The same thing kept happening year after year, and what would happen is the ground would freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, and it would work those rocks under the ground up to the surface. So farming was a hard proposition in the North, mainly because of the thin, rocky soil. Industry in the South was kind of like how farming was in the North. There was very little industry and manufacturing in the South. This is a picture of a textile mill. Textiles they create fabric for clothes. So farming, cotton especially, was so profitable, Southerners stayed with it. Now in the South, a large portion of the population was made up of slaves, and slaves don't have money. So because of this, there weren't as many people that could buy manufactured goods, so industry really never developed. They didn't have as big a market to sell things. Hey, you want to buy this cannon? No, I'm a slave. I don't have any money. So in the North, they did not have slavery. But, they didn't really officially have slavery, but they kind of had slavery unofficially. A lot of people went and worked in factories, and these factories didn't pay very much, or really didn't pay enough for them to live off. So if they needed food or something they couldn't afford, a lot of these companies had the company store that you could buy things on credit. And once you owed money to the company store, they kind of had you over a barrel. You couldn't leave until you paid them off. And it was almost impossible to pay them off. So they kind of had slavery a little different way in the North. But they did have African American workers in the North. And there was a lot of racism. African Americans were discriminated against. They couldn't vote, they couldn't go to white schools, they couldn't use white hospitals. So they had kind of a rough time, but some of them still succeeded. In the South, they did have slavery, and they had different types. They had different types of slaves. They had domestic slaves who were kind of at the top of the list. They had the best work. They worked in the big house. They did the cooking, the cleaning, and the laundry, and they got to dress nice. Here's a picture of a domestic slave taking care of one of the white children. Notice how she's dressed in a nice dress and she looks good and everything. Okay, they also had their own blacksmiths. Here's some slaves working in a blacksmith shop. Now, I think if I was a slave, I would want to have some kind of a job like a blacksmith or a carpenter or a shoemaker or a weaver. These guys actually had trades. When they worked on plantations, they had all these kinds of jobs. Or even pasture workers, or you might call them cowboys, the ones that work with the livestock, the horses, the cattle, the sheep. But these guys that knew how to do something, knew how to create something, they would sometimes loan them out to other people that needed this kind of a job done, and they would sometimes get paid. So these guys kind of had real jobs, and I think these probably were the best ones. Now, the absolute worst slaves were the field hands. They had the absolute hardest job. They worked from sunup to sundown, and they had it hard. These guys didn't live as long. They got worn out in the hot sun all day. So the slaves endured hardship and misery. The slaves worked very hard, and they had little hope for freedom. But their greatest fear was being separated from their families. I don't think it was legal for slaves to get married officially, but they did get married. Sometimes they called the ceremony jumping the broom. And they had kids, and they had little family units. And sometimes these family units would get sold away, depending on if their plantation owners needed money or for whatever reason. And sometimes it caused them to run away when that happened, rather than being separated from their families. Right now, most of the white people in the South were small farmers called yeomen. and they mostly lived in the upper South, up in here, and they farmed small farms of like between 50 and 100 acres, and they had smaller houses. Not many of these yeoman farmers had slaves. If they did, it might be one. And they didn't really agree with slavery. But when the Northerners started telling the Southerners that slavery was bad and they couldn't do it, they had issues with that. Even though they may not have agreed with slavery and didn't have slaves themselves, they didn't like the Northerners telling them what to do, so they backed slavery because of that. Plantations were the big ones. They were large, self-sufficient farms with, sometimes as big as 3,000 acres. They were the ones with the big mansions and all the slaves, and all the different types of slaves. These plantations were the ones that were self-sufficient, and sometimes they even had schools and churches on the plantations. All right, so what I want you to do is on your note taker in the middle section, write these 7 bullets down. Many people move to cities to find work. Cities grow crowded, and many live in unhealthy and unsafe conditions. African Americans suffer discrimination and have few rights. Plantation owners farm large tracts of land. Plantations are generally self-sufficient. Yeomen make up the largest group of the whites, and tenant farmers farm small tracts of land. Enslaved African Americans do most of the work on plantations. Now, these tenant farmers that I really didn't talk about, I think of the tenant farmers happening more after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished. These big plantation owners had all this land, and they didn't have any slaves anymore to work it, so what they did was they rented out 50 acres to a family. They put a shack on it, and these ex-slaves would farm this land. Well, to pay their rent, they would have to give like 3/4 of their crop to the guy who owns the land, the old plantation owners, and they would get to keep like 1/4 of the crop. Well, that 1/4 of the crop was barely enough to live on. So basically, these guys gave them a place to stay and food to eat, and what really wasn't much different than being a slave. The only difference was that if they wanted to leave, they could. So tenant farmers were another group in the South. All right, and then the last part is transportation. Northern transportation contributed to the success of industry. They built thousands of miles of roads and canals, and by 1860 there was 30,000 miles of railroad tracks in the country, but 20,000 of them were in the North. All the major cities in the North were connected with each other and the West through a network of railroad tracks. And if you look at this map, you can see how many more railroad tracks are in the North than in the South. Now, Southern transportation, they had natural waterways which provided the main means for transporting goods in the South, like rivers. There were few canals, and roads were poor. Like the North, the South had also built railroads, but not as many. They were short, and they did not connect all parts of the region. So you can look here and see that the Southern railroads are not as extensive as the Northern railroads. All right, so on your note taker, under transportation, for the North, I want you to write roads, canals, and railroads being built, locomotives improved during this area, and even steamboats. In the South, natural waterways were the chief means of transportation, canals and roads were poor, and railroads were limited. All right, now, I was going to have you guys do a blabberize. You were supposed to do this at home. You were supposed to find 2 pictures, and one guy represents a Northerner and one guy represents a Southerner, and they were going to tell about the transportation systems of each place. So I'll go ahead and play this.
Well, sir, I'm from the North, and in the North, we have a lot of railroads. In fact, we have so many railroads, it connects all the cities in our country. Don't you think that's smart? I'm from the South, and I want to tell you about it. Well, we don't have very good roads in the South. Well, we don't have very good canals. When we transfer our goods, we transfer them on the river. Some people call it the creek.
All right. So that was just kind of a fun way to talk about the North and the South. Here's your notebook. I want you to take this note taker that you just took. Now, this picture shows the note taker closed and then the note taker open. So take it and glue the note taker right in the middle of this section. Draw a picture of the United States on the outside and write North and South. Color it up a little bit. On the right side here, I want you to create a Venn diagram of the North and the South. And I want you to put the things that apply to the North on this side, the things that apply to the South on this side, and the things that apply to both. One example would they both had roads, they both had railroads, they both had canals, so those would go into here. They just weren't as good in the South. No, they both had African American workers. The South had slaves, and the North had factory workers. Just remember that the northern African Americans were very much discriminated against. Now, once all this is done, I want you to use the note taker and the Venn diagram to write an essay comparing and contrasting northern and southern lifestyles. And that is your video lesson of the day, kids. Thank you.